This is Speaking of Shakespeare, a series of conversations about things Shakespearean, with a focus on new digital technologies and also about developments in Shakespearean performance and education across the globe. I'm Thomas Dabbs, recording this introduction from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. The following conversation is with David McInnis of the University of Melbourne. We will talk, among other things, about things lost, and particularly about lost plays in the early modern period in England. This conversation is made possible with the help of institutional support from Aoyama Gakuin University. This series is also funded by a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, called Kaken, and this organization, thankfully, includes support for research in the humanities. Hello, David. Good afternoon. I've known you for years. We've known each other by email for years, and we've never met. I've never actually seen you in person, and this is the closest I've come. So
it's taken a pandemic to bring us together.
It's taken a pandemic to bring us together. And we should have seen each other.
Absolutely.
There were certain times, and I was in the Folger library with you at the same time and missed you some years ago when you were researching there, and so was I. And we should have, but it didn't happen. But it's kind of happening now and will happen in the future, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to meeting in real life some point soon when travel is possible again and the world comes back to being a little bit more normal, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm hoping that will be very, very soon. But we have some exciting news for you. You have a book coming out on lost plays from the Cambridge University Press. And
I'm very excited.
Yes, and not only do you do really lost plays, you kind of have a bit of a philosophy about things lost and recovering things lost. And anyway, tell us a little bit about your book and what is the central theme, of course, is lost plays, but what do you say about lost plays?
Well, Tom, I know you, or we know each other because you signed up to become a contributor to the Lost Plays database that I founded with Ros Knutson back in 2009, and that I now edit with Matt Steggle and Misha Teramura, and is now hosted by the Folger Shakespeare Library. And that project, and you've given us at least half a dozen entries of information about plays that were once available and performed, perhaps, and have since been lost to modern audiences. We don't have play texts for them anymore. And what fascinates me about these texts is how significantly influential these plays would have been during Shakespeare's lifetime, because there were things that people Shakespeare knew, maybe Shakespeare himself would have seen. So they would have been an easy reference point for anyone who's interested in drama. If you went to see a Shakespeare play, you would draw on your knowledge of other plays that you had seen as the most popular form of entertainment from the period. So that was an immediate context that helps us make sense of the work of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And it's frustratingly, elusively just beyond our grasp at present, because most of us have been trained in that 20th century school of close reading that leave aside formalist analysis, which requires a text. So when you don't have a text, suddenly these things are a little bit too difficult to grapple with until quite recently, I think. And I think there have been some important shifts in the way scholarship in this period has been done, which now lets us make better use of these lost plays and what we know about them. So that database that you contribute to is a database, right? There's some new ideas in there, of course. There's some new identifications and discoveries, but essentially it's a storehouse of information about the lost plays. It's the sum total of what we know. And so the book that I've just put out is my attempt to do something with that data, that information. I think I was encouraged by the wonderful responses I've had over the years. People who get excited by the prospect of working on lost plays, but I haven't yet seen a lot of that translate into other people's work necessarily. And so what I really wanted to do was to show people through this book how it's possible to work with lost plays, what it means for everyone, ranging from performance scholars and textual scholars to theatre historians, and everything in between, really, why everyone can and should be using lost plays in their work. And that's what I've tried to do with this book.
Well, I can't wait to read it. Now, yes, I'm an enthusiast, and I did some entries. These are not easy entries to do because you have to collaborate a lot of different sources. And fortunately, Wiggins has his multi-volume work that I think is exquisitely well done.
Mm.
And there's no real, I've seen no real problems there, but for the fact that it's hard copy, and you have to go back and forth, and maybe another volume here and there, and I have little markings. Whereas the way that Lost Plays database is developing is that it's getting very good in terms of searchable information, where you can do, because a lot of this stuff requires cross-referencing and collaborating two different particular plays and so forth. So the online resource is extremely important to research and being able to see the whole picture. It's just wonderful in that regard.
Oh, thank you for that, Tom. I should say that Martin Wiggins' incredibly useful catalogue of British drama, which is nearing completion now, he's only got 2 volumes left to come out, is, you know, encyclopedic in terms of knowledge. He has read everything and he's looked up everything, along with, in conjunction with Catherine Richardson, who's also on that project. It's a phenomenal resource. And there is now a digital version of that, which is not a database. It's like the Oxford Text Online, their platform. So you can search things online. But one of the principal differences between what Martin has accomplished in that magnificent catalogue and what we try to do in the Lost Plays database is A, the database, our database, is open access. It will never cost anyone anything to use it. But B, where Martin lists where references can be found, he has citations, which are quite incredible and fantastically useful. We try and transcribe those historical documents, or to digitize the original manuscripts or other print documents, and actually provide direct access through our database, so that our users can come along to that entry for a lost play and look at the primary evidence itself. And they can see it in context, because we usually try to link to the bigger document that it came from. So for example, if we're dealing with a play from, say, the 1590s that we know of primarily through the records of the Rose Playhouse manager, Philip Henslow, we can look at Henslow's diary and excerpt the relevant lines for our entry, but we also hyperlink to the digitized version of the diary, so you can see the context those lines came from and see what other plays were being performed that week or that month. And so it enables a kind of lateral exploration. You really do go down the rabbit hole with, you know, with Alice in Wonderland, and you start exploring in non-linear ways, I suppose. And you are, I hope, empowered as the reader by the provision of that full transcription or digitization to then go away and make your own judgments and build your own arguments as well. And so I hope it becomes quite productive in that sense.
Yeah, I want to go into that a little bit and the way it's helped my research, but I don't want to miss the fact that when I first started working with you in my smaller contribution to a few little plays, you were pretty much independent. And then I noticed that you became affiliated with the Folger Shakespeare Library, and that now is your domain. And that partnership is superb, I think, because I know, and you know, the members of that team, Eric Johnson and the members of his team, and they are extraordinarily good people. And what a wonderful collaboration or collaborative partner you have with the Folger.
Oh, absolutely. We are completely blessed to have that resource, to have the support of the Folger team behind the database now is not just peace of mind. It's really tremendously reassuring in terms of the stability and the longevity of our website, and also just you know, the fact that it's now part of a suite of resources there, the Folger resources, that collectively, you know, the sum exceeds the parts. I mean, they already have their early modern plays online, and their access to digitizations. So with our information on Lost Plays, they sort of have everything from the period, really. But yes, we started off at the University of Melbourne. That's my home institution. You can see in my background here. And it started off as a very small project. In fact, the prototype for the Lost Plays database was developed by final year IT students who were looking for what they called an industry project. And so I gave them this academic problem, this challenge, you know, that we needed a solution for, and that's what they came up with. And that prototype served us very well for a number of years. But I should confess it was only ever sort of tacitly hosted by my university. It wasn't something that we went out of our way to make a big song and dance about it. We found some room on a server and we shuffled in there, and that was fine. But we didn't have any funding. We didn't have that sort of IT support. I did manage to secure a very large grant from the Australian Research Council, which I'm tremendously grateful for, a 6-figure grant back in 2014. And that enabled, amongst other things, some of the digitization work, so that our users could access manuscript images free of charge. through the database, but it still didn't really provide ongoing IT support. So now that we're affiliated with the Folger and that they can host our site, we have that security, that stability, and it means that we have every confidence moving forward that we're going to be around for a very long time.
Yeah, it's become sort of cliche in our business in terms of digital development. When you have students, and particularly graduate students, the problem with graduate students who are often extraordinarily diligent is that they graduate. And
They have a habit of doing that, don't they?
They have a habit of doing this in the name. And so what you have at the Folger is what you're saying, stability and a dedicated staff. And, along with the actual technical support, there's a heck of a lot of moral support that comes with that too.
Yes.
And a wonderful international collaborative effort that has this global reach that is wonderful to include for the project. Do you see this then as kind of continuing the Lost Plays project, just keeping on and keeping on? I don't see
that's
why.
right.
I mean, we're going
Exactly.
to continue to find new stuff.
Well, that's right. Our work is never going to be done, which sounds like the sort of thing you shouldn't admit for grant applications and so forth. That people like to fund discrete projects that are achievable within a finite time period. But the fact is, this is ongoing work. There is a tremendous amount of information to locate and to transcribe, to then put into dialogue with the scholarship that has been written, to investigate possible narrative and dramatic sources for, which takes time and responsible conjecture, I suppose. So there's a lot of information to put together and to make judicious judgments about how to assemble that information. And then there's a number of plays to do that for. And so working our way through what was originally going to be just 1580 or so to 1642 with the closure of the theatres, that itself is a huge project. The reason it's a collaborative enterprise is because it exceeds my knowledge alone, exceeds Roslyn Knutson's knowledge alone when the two of us were working together. And we have all these wonderful, we've got about 3 dozen people who contribute now to varying degrees. Some just do one entry and they've had their say. Others keep coming back and do tens of entries, and that's wonderful too. So we do rely on the expertise of a number of people across the world and on growing that team of collaborators as well. The more we grow like that, the more I see scope to work backwards. We've started populating some 1570s and 1560s entries now as well, and we hope to formalize that soon with some proper tables of contents for those currently invisible decades in our database. We've been approached by colleagues in Europe actually about doing restoration plays as well, so extending the historical reach in the other direction too, beyond 1642 right through the end of the century. And that's something I'd really like to know more about and spend a lot more time on, but that will take a concerted effort, and we'll have to think carefully about how we expand in that regard. I've also had a number of questions over the years about whether we'll consider doing continental plays or plays from other countries in general, which I think has fantastic potential, but again, not my primary research expertise. So I'd need the right people to make sure that we have that quality control there and that we're doing a responsible job of it.
I contributed to 4 or 5, I can't remember exactly, I think 5 plays in the database, and I did it more or less for the love of it. Because I'm just that nerdy, I think, but I'm in the autumn years of my career. I really don't need to amass publications or whatnot. But what I want to do is just be king for a day and make a declaration that if you contribute to Lost Plays database or to the Agus map or to any of these ongoing projects, that you get credit where credit is due. And that way I can encourage some of my colleagues in Japan, younger people who can do this type of work and do it much more meticulously really than I can, who are unflawed in their and unflappable, and they just don't stop until every detail is right, which is the type of diligence you want. But I think some people might feel like, oh no, I have to do something else. I'm going to have to get that referee publication, and I have to stack up everything and get my portfolio ready for whatever review, evaluation, or whatnot. Do you see a change happening though in mentality about credit given to work like digital publication, as would happen on your site?
I absolutely do. I think that conversation changes around the world, and how our work is recognized institutionally is always going to be refined and adjusted. Here in Australia, I've just edited Thomas Dekker's Old Fortunatus for the Revels Plays series, which is, a wonderful series. But literally until the year my edition came out, scholarly editions didn't count as scholarship in this country. So that was a labor of love for me. I spent almost 10 years working on that book, out of the pure joy and love of that play, and a desire to see Dekker's work attended to more widely. And I just happened to get lucky that essentially the year it came out, my university in particular started counting it the same way they would count an academic monograph. So these things change all the time. In the case of the Lost Plays database and those individual entries, they are all edited by the general editors. So Misha, Matt, and myself will look through everything that is published on the database, as Ros used to do before she became editor emerita of the whole thing. So there is quality control built into it in that regard. Whether an institution wants to count that as peer-reviewed or not is another matter, and I can see there's an argument why a lot of the work could be considered tertiary rather than secondary if it's an assemblage of known information, and on a particular title the contributor hasn't advanced new original thinking as well. They've simply summarized what's out there. That's a tremendous service to scholarship, but it may not be what their institution counts as peer-reviewed and original insights, right? So to that, I would just point out that there is a way that this is still going to be productive for you. If you are thinking about writing a peer-reviewed article in a journal or a book chapter for an academic publication, I still recommend working on these Lost Plays database entries and using those as your working notes, if you like. I wrote an essay about Richard Wilson for Helen Ostovich when she was doing the Three Lords and Ladies of London project. And to do that, I wrote all the entries about Lost Plays for Wilson. And so I have, quite a few of those Wilson plays now documented, and having put all that data up there online, I had then had that at my fingertips, and I was able to use that as my research to draft the article. I knew all the historical records. I knew everything that had been written about these lost plays, all that scholarship that all had to be read and summarized for those entries. And then I had those building blocks ready to use to make my own article out of thereafter. So it's never going to be a waste of time. There's a way of thinking about how you're going to benefit from doing such things. And as you were hinting before, Tom, as well, more and more universities are recognizing the benefit of being the kind of good global citizen who contributes to digital projects, especially open access ones. And it's a form of public engagement. It's a service to scholarship. There are all sorts of useful things that come out of doing this kind of work, regardless of whether it ends up being classified as peer-reviewed or not.
Yeah. Now, what you're saying brings up really a long history. I studied under a bibliographer of Shakespeare, Trevor Howard Hill, and no one ever questioned his enormous contribution. I think he was the editor of the British Bibliography of Bibliographies, meta level, and on the computers very, very early on. And there's a whole list. We all go back to these really bibliophiles, these collectors who put together information. There's some interpretation. E.K. Chambers, usually when I go to Chambers, I'm not looking for some new theoretical angle. I'm looking for information that he had to collaborate with other information. Fuellert for the Office of the Rebels, so that I've used that a lot in recent years. And the point I'm making is I'm using them. Now I could name right off the top of my head 36 people who were huge, big deals in the 80s and 90s in critical theory. And I am not opposed to critical thinking and critical theory at all. Very open-minded, but they're gone. It's done. There's nothing else to do there in a lot of the subfields that they had chosen. And I'm still using these basic sources. They're the ones that still are driving this forward. And so it makes me wonder whether or not the work that people do in this bibliographical area isn't in some ways much more enduring than the latest spin that all of us have on a play or on a particular trend in that has not yet been seen in early modern drama or in Shakespeare.
I'll reserve judgment about our colleagues working in theory and things like that, and I won't cast any nasturtiums on their work. I think, as you say, it is incredibly valuable work. Sometimes things move on, and maybe
and
doesn't
I
have the
do it.
longevity. Yeah, we all do that.
Yeah.
But what I will say is Bill Ingram wrote a really lovely essay for a book I edited last year, Loss and the Literary Culture of Shakespeare's Time. And Bill was drawing attention to the fact that facts by themselves don't really have value, I suppose. They're relatively neutral. And what happens that it makes them valuable is when people bring attention to them and interpret them and make use of them. And so perhaps the work of Chambers and others isn't especially glamorous, doing that hard slog of archival work and documenting things that on the surface of it amount to nothing. They seem to be a very obscure reference to something, but those facts are tremendously enabling and providing that access to that information, that raw data, so that other people can then go and do their things with it. That's why that kind of work persists over time, because you can keep coming back to it and keep finding new meaning there and joining new dots and finding exciting discoveries and whole perspective shift with the addition of just one more piece of information coupled with what was already there. And so I think that for me, that is in a very nerdy way, quite exciting work, but I can see how it can be perceived as being dry or tedious to some, right?
You don't get far in this business without being a nerd.
That's right.
It's been a great joy in my life to be nerdy. But I'll give you one case in point. And one thing that drew me to the work that I did on the Lost Plays site was that I was looking simultaneously at Midsummer Night's Dream and the workmen in Midsummer Night's Dream, and how these workmen seem to sort of appear at the in those records, Fuller records. And I needed more of a connection between that play and what was going on with artisans around the theater. A lot of work has been done on that. And there it was, right there with Thomas Painter and with Ovid. And you could just cross references and see that there was a generation of playwrights before Shakespeare who went straight to Arthur Golding's translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses or Metamorphoses, and then Thomas Painter's Palace of Pleasure. They just knew, just like with Marvel Comics, you go straight there, you're going to get a base audience. You're going to get your base audience. And not only that, you're going to get the aristocratic audience because you're at a level where, oh, these are stories, old continental classical stories. That's good. And you can run them right through the popular playhouses that are popping up, 20 years or so before Shakespeare. And so that's just one example of what is revealed by an examination of a database like that.
Absolutely. And that elusive quest for what was Shakespeare doing in the 1580s. He must have done something theatrical. He must have been in London by that stage. We don't really know much about him until 1594 or so. And for now, that is true. We don't have the documentary record of what Shakespeare specifically was doing, but we do know an awful lot about what everyone else was doing in the theatre industry. There's a lot of information out there, a lot of plays that survive and a lot of records for those that don't, that paint a very rich picture of the pre-Shakespeare period. And there's that wonderful project over in the UK in London, Before Shakespeare, right? That's dealing precisely with that period and how much we do know about the pre-Shakespeare London theatrical scene. And there's a wealth of information that suddenly helps us make sense of what Shakespeare was doing earlier in his career, especially in terms of what his playgoing public understood the theatres to be and what his contemporaries understood their craft to be. So it makes it much richer and easier for us then to understand what Shakespeare was doing, to situate his achievements within that context.
Well, I can see this also being collaborated with what's going on at MOLA and the archeological finds and so forth, particularly with the Curtain Theater. And I had the pleasure of meeting one of the members of their team a couple of years back. And there was a huge debate that went all the way through lunch because that theater was supposed to be circular.
Right.
And it doesn't look like it was. It looks like it was square. And I'm going, okay, so it was square. But that really bothered some poor souls who had a good bit of a good bit of their career invested in the wooden O, as it's called. So.
Well, I actually touch on this a little bit in my current book. This is one of the moments where, so one of the things I did want to do throughout this book was to be quite open and transparent about when we have to do guesswork, because the documentary record simply isn't sufficient for us to offer conclusions with any degree of certainty. It's patchy at best, right? We have irregular intervals of really rich, detailed historical information, and then periods where there's not really enough to say things with confidence. And in terms of Shakespeare's company, for whom we don't have an equivalent of Henslow's diary, the second part of the 1590s isn't necessarily that strong. There's a period 1596 to 98. I'd love to have a lot more information about what the company was doing, but that's the period around which Shakespeare's company does move to the Curtain, which is the playhouse you're talking about, Tom, that was always assumed to have been circular, and excavations in Shoreditch about 6 years ago now, no, more than 6 years ago now, were shown, have suggested that it was actually a rectangular building instead. And so in that part of my book, because the book is chronological, mapping Shakespeare's career over time against what's known of the lost plays from the same periods, I instead start thinking about what it would have meant for his company to have moved from the theatre, as it was called, the circular building, when that lease expired. And everyone knows that famous, slightly apocryphal story about the lease expiring on the theatre and Shakespeare's company eventually dismantling that building and taking it across the Thames and rebuilding it as the Globe. You know, in some versions, it happens in the middle of winter when the Thames is frozen over, and they literally carried over in one night, and it's all exaggerated. But there's a kernel of truth to the story in terms of them transporting the wood. But in the interim, they moved next door to the Curtain. And I'm quite interested in what happened at that point, because traditionally that's been seen as a low point in the company's career. They were forced by necessity, having been evicted from their previous location, to make do at the Curtain, which had always been assumed to be an inferior make-do venue, right? But with this information that we now have, with Muller's suggestion that the Curtain's dimensions were significantly larger as well as rectangular, that offers us pause to reconsider what happened at that moment. And I suggest that it may have been an unsought for start of something bigger for the company. We like to celebrate when they finally arrived at the Globe. That was the announcement of, we've made it, we've got this purpose-built venue, this is ours, we can be proud of it. But the Curtain offered certain possibilities they hadn't had previously, including much grander scale for fights. Think of all the fight scenes in Romeo and Juliet, for processions and marches and hunting scenes. Think about Titus Andronicus, which was reprinted shortly after the move to the Curtain and was likely therefore to still have been in repertory at that point in time. So it seems to me that just like ballet companies, when they transfer from one stage to a significantly larger stage, have to re-rehearse all their choreography and think about the expanded space they're going to occupy, or else use shutters and different scenery to try and make the bigger space small enough so they can retain their old steps. I don't think they would have done that for Shakespeare's company. I think Shakespeare's company would have been more likely to have had to rethink how they made use of space on a significantly larger Curtain stage. And so it's quite interesting to think not of lost plays at that point, but lost performances and lost choreography and lost movements of bodies in space, and how the plays that we have today may have been performed on two very different scaled venues, and what difference that would have made to performance as well. Those two plays in particular, Romeo and Juliet and Titus, are the ones I talk a little bit about, but the principle extends to quite a few others from that period also.
Well, I know that you, like me, occasionally I'm asked to review a paper for publication or whatnot. And I always do the, I don't know if I can use the term, it's a sandwich with something really, really bad
yes.
in the bread. Okay, let's just use our imagination. But you start out very positively, say, okay, here's where it could get better. And then you end with an upbeat note, because all of us have gone through this. All of us have submitted something to a journal or, an idea, a proposal, and had it come back. You don't succeed in this business if you don't get rejected, right? So, and it's amazed me how how vitriolic some people can be in their rejections. Like, my goodness, okay, what else? You want my children to enjoy some kind of misfortune? What does that have to do? But I've heard more than once that you can't use non-evidence as use of evidence. And in one case, it was very fair. I was stretching a bit. But in another case, I said, yeah, you can. If you're looking for dinosaur bones and you have 1 hectare there and you have all the equipment you have now and you find no dinosaur bones, over 20 years of searching, you might assume that, well, there weren't many dinosaurs here. They didn't pass through here. Well, at least they didn't die here. So, there are cases where what is lacking tells you something. And I think you just brought that up too, about the performances. What we're missing an O. So that means something else was done, and I love the cross well, these are sub-disciplines, let's say, but there are people who are solely devoted to acting and theater and performance, and those who are solely and very dedicated to theater history. And then more people like us who are more textual, bibliographical, rather, well, we're not very, in Lost Plays, we're not being very textual, but bibliographical. But the people who, like us, who learn early on what you can learn from, in my case, just going through a card catalog before you even get to the book, or the old MLA bibliography that was published every year that we sort of waited on to see what was coming out. But there are things when they aren't. Well, I did a book on Marlowe, and basically what I saw was no Marlowe for 150 years. And that was the beginning of why wasn't there a Marlowe, and why suddenly was there a Marlowe. So like you say, a lot of ideas come out of just looking through bibliographies, and yes, it is a bit nerdy. Now you have something here on virtual that kind of caught my attention. The well, you have quite a lot this going on here. I don't know. I told this to Brett Greatly Hirsch last week when I talked with him. I thought that I was going to have to wait till the end of the pandemic, get a handheld camera, and chase him down the street, because I can't see when you guys stop working. But there is, you did something with, let's see if I can find it here very quickly. Virtual reality, that's it. That's what, now that's forthcoming, and that's an addition. Yeah, you're bringing out in 2021. What's going on with virtual reality and Shakespeare?
First, I will just say it's quite an honor to be compared to Brett in terms of his productivity. We're very old friends, and I always keep an eye on how productive he's being, and he's one step ahead of me. Like, I'm always thinking about what he's doing next. So hi, Brett, if you're watching. No, Shakespeare and Virtual Reality is a project that I've been working on with Stephen Wittek from Carnegie Mellon University. It's his brainchild, really. Stephen has a large fellowship funded project on virtual reality that enabled him to go to the Blackfriars Recreated Theatre in Stanton, Virginia, where the American Shakespeare Center is, and to film a few scenes in that theatrical space using the 360 cameras that I think Google lent them, actually. So they're quite state-of-the-art, expensive machineries that he's been using. And I knew he was interested in that. I have experimented, I've dabbled a little bit for pedagogical purposes. I'm not a director or an actor or anything like that, but I have friends who are, colleagues who are even. We filmed the final scene of Taming of the Shrew in 360 as part of a project to develop a suite of pedagogical resources for when I teach Shakespeare here at Melbourne. We filmed the same scene 3 different ways using the Melbourne Uni Shakespeare Company, which are a student group, who that year had decided to perform Taming of the Shrew in a very dark, domestic abuse focus way, I suppose, rather than anything lighthearted or slapstick. And so we got them to film it 3 different ways without changing the text, just changing the acting styles and the technology to allow my students to understand how production variables contribute to the creation of interpretation, how they can change it to create the actor's vision, the director's vision. And the 360 footage one was really quite interesting, I think, because coupled with that darker take, you felt incredibly claustrophobic being stuck in that room. And if you've done any VR or 360 experience, you know you're often stationary. You often can rotate, you can pivot and swivel and look all around you, up and down and so forth, choose what to look at or what not to look at, but you often can't move. So you're not so much a fly on the wall as you're right in the thick of things. And it's a very uncomfortable scene, that final monologue from Caterina, where we think she's been completely broken down and become submissive to her husband, Petruchio. She's been tamed, as per the title. So having that shot in 360 is quite profoundly discomforting.
So, veil your stomachs, for it is no boot, and place your hands below your husband's foot, in token of which duty, if he please.
So Stephen knew I'd done that, and so the 2 of us led a seminar at SAA on Shakespeare and virtual reality, and we now have a contract with Cambridge for their Elements series on Shakespeare and pedagogy. And we put together a series of small papers, so micro chapters, about using 360 and virtual reality technology in the classroom, essentially, and thinking about what Shakespeare can do for virtual reality as well as what virtual reality can do for Shakespeare. So I give Stephen full credit for dragging me into this. I'm very excited to be his passenger and his co-driver on this. It's very much his project in the first instance, and I've learned a great deal from being immersed quite literally in that world. It's really exciting to see how people are experimenting with technology.
Yes, it is. And I saw his presentation in 2019 at the Digitizing the Stage conference. It was hosted by the Folger and the Bodleian, some of our friends there, and got to see a smidgen of what was going on. It's very, very interesting. Of course, the resources at Carnegie Mellon, they are built historically to do digital humanities, really, because they, for a long, long time, have had much more of a collaborative environment between technology and humanistic study that now other places, of course, many very famously have acquired over the past couple of decades. And so I'm going to move along a little here. Now, you've done some more Lost Plays, and Timon of Athens. I interviewed Ben Crystal, the actor Ben. I don't know if you've met him, but he did a Timon of Athens recently. We talked about how actors, have to survive, have to eat, pay their rent during a pandemic back last year. And I don't know if the answer is good, but they're experimenting with ways to do theater and do their work. The work that they do, which really is built for face-to-face, stage acting environments. So there's a group there. The show must go online.
Yes,
it's a website. Yeah, and he was working with. But you did Timon. You were really attracted to. You don't go for Hamlet. You go for things that are a little bit more on the fringe, off the. And I did too in my career. So, what do you?
Look, the big joke here is that I've never been a Shakespearean per se. I've always been more of an early modernist and I've been attracted to all of Shakespeare's contemporaries except Shakespeare, and yet Shakespeare's the name that always crops up, right? So when you teach, it's Shakespeare you'd have to teach first and foremost. When you explain to someone outside the industry what you do, you don't say early modernist, you say Shakespeare. And so, my friends like to tease me because now I've got this book out on Shakespeare and Lost Plays, and the next book I'll be doing will be the scholarly edition of Timon of Athens, which I haven't actually started yet. That's the work in progress. It's about to commence when I'm on sabbatical next semester. And I also have plans for another monograph on Shakespeare at present too. So I find myself in a ridiculous situation of moving from all of Shakespeare's contemporaries to suddenly doing 3 books in a row on Shakespeare after having sworn I'd never do such a thing. But Timon of Athens is just an interesting play. Look, I think it's a play that has never been much loved, but I think, Jan Kott had this argument about Midsummer Night's Dream, which everyone knows in Shakespeare Our Contemporary, and it's quite an out there reading, a psychoanalytic reading and about the sexuality in Midsummer Night's Dream. But the interesting thing he says about it that stuck with me always was that Shakespeare was trying to do something in Midsummer Night's Dream that was only imperfectly realized and didn't become readily or widely understood and accessible until centuries later, when we passed through the lens of the surrealists and other avant-garde artistic movements that enabled us to see the world differently and therefore understand what Shakespeare was driving at in Midsummer Night's Dream differently. And I think Timon is like that too. I think the time is right for Timon now. It's a play that hasn't made much sense, but I think the pandemic in particular has changed the way people think about the world, about social relationships, about isolation, about what it means to be part of a community or a society, about a society that is structured on transactions, that commodifies people and relationships rather than thinking about the people behind those relationships and the human interaction side of things. It's a play that gestures repeatedly towards plague and sickness. It uses them as metaphors, but in a very disturbing sense of moral contagion and psychological abuse almost, in ways that resonate with us, I find, since the pandemic has hit, in a way that I just don't think Timon had that purchase on our imaginations previously. And I'm not saying this in a self-promoting way, because as I said, I haven't even started work on this edition yet, but I really do predict this will become one of the most important Shakespeare plays in the coming decade. I think its significance is only now going to become fully apparent to people because our collective mindsets have been indelibly adjusted by the pandemic. this COVID outbreak has fundamentally shifted the way we think about the world and our interactions with people. And I think this play is well poised to speak to that new modern condition in a way that perhaps it's always been an outlier for the past 4 centuries and hasn't been much loved.
Yeah, and you're talking about some very serious stuff, and I think I caught myself smiling on camera here because I was thinking, you know, I'm going to write you a little email and say, okay, here's your next article, and I already have the title, "Time for Timon."
Thank you.
And all you have to do is just say what you just said there and add in whatever supporting evidence, and you got it. It's there. It's time.
Excellent. That's a freebie. Thank you.
And,
I'll be sure to acknowledge you.
yeah, this is how articles are born and how thoughts are born. I'm going to move down here to one of my pet things, Tamburlaine. And you've done a critical reader of Tamburlaine. I would say if I had to choose one play that kind of converted me to Renaissance, at that time it was called Renaissance tragedy. But you know, you read, okay, Shakespeare, yes, okay, but you read Tamburlaine and you go, what is this?
Yeah.
You know, who is this guy? And you think it's impossible. It's just impossible that somebody could write something like this. And then you get into it and you go, it's just stunning. You know, I am whoever. Now, I talked with Brett about this. There has always been a little bit of concern about Marlowe's authorship, right? And I told Brett that it would be fine for me to go to my death thinking that Marlowe wrote the play, just to have somebody to attach to that level of genius. But there is a problem there, and here we are. We're I'm from the American South, and we're of different ages and different. But here we are with Tamburlaine. You know, it's just a stunning play and not the most PC plays out.
But none of Marlowe is, you know.
None of Marlowe is. Pretty much everybody just gets it, you know.
Marlowe is profoundly shocking, but also magnificent and inspiring in a very visceral way that Shakespeare often isn't. Shakespeare is appreciated by many. Marlowe sort of shocks you out of any apathy you may have and makes you sit up and pay attention, I think. There is something startlingly different about Marlowe's kind of writing. I mean, Michael Stapleton has that wonderful book about Marlowe and Ovid, and thinking about the way most poets from this period model their poetic career on Virgil, but Marlowe turns to Ovid instead. And there is something categorically different, I think, about Marlowe's work. It is exciting, it's raw, it's passionate, it's emotional, it's violent, it's sadistic at times. But it is original in our sense of the word original. Like, I think for most of Shakespeare's peers, originality meant a return to origins, and it was, the Renaissance and rebirthing the classic. And Shakespeare was imitating and refining and tweaking. And the way I like to think of it is, Shakespeare often had the last word on something. He would take something that was already out there that people had been playing with, a story that was well known, and he would refine that. And he was just superb at coming up with like a definitive version of that was masterful. Marlowe, I think, has the first word more often. I think he's much more exciting in that regard. He comes up with these sensational ideas and concepts for plays and stories for plays, and the sound of his writing, that Marlowe's mighty line, as Ben Jonson called it, is just astonishing to listen to. It bowls me over every time. And when I teach Marlowe, and I teach about 3 or 4 of his plays to my 4th year students, my honors students, I always make sure we read some of that out loud in class, because there's something about speaking the Marlowean verse that is just wow.
Well, behind me, I fortunately have that magnificent recording they made of Ian McClellan's Edward II.
Mm-hmm.
And I had it was granted a graduate class of maybe 4 students, and we did Edward II. And now these are second language people, and we're in the early modern period. So usually I put on the subtitles. And at one point, one student said, "We don't need these. This is understandable." And it's amazing how the clarity, and it's all in pentameter, iambic pentameter. It is not that, but the clarity of those speeches in Edward II. And you have it in Marlowe. In Tamburlaine, there's no doubt what's going on. There's certain sorts of conceits in there that you may have to pull out and read and kind of figure out where he's going. but Shakespeare can get a little bit, I think the word would be naughty in meaning, to take a little while to get through it. Whereas Marlowe is just very direct, right there in your face.
I don't know if you watched the Ben Elton series Upstart Crow with David Mitchell as Shakespeare, but they're frequently making jokes about the Shakespeare character just being so obsessed with his own cleverness and coming up with these very naughty passages and dense allusions, and they're very, very witty, but no one else understands them. They all think they're tedious and dull and boring.
Well, it can get that way. So we're supposed to reimagine. You've been talking about reimagining things and going through. The example I've used in other conversations I've had is the ending, the kind of famous ending of Romeo and Juliet. There's nothing that's not famous about the play, but the ending is, as written, I always thought was just stupid. The guy gets locked up because there's a plague out there, and that's why the letter doesn't get to Romeo, and that's why everything ultimately ends badly. And I thought that was stupid until the past year. I had to live through a plague where I had to see the reality of how you could get locked up, and how that might keep a letter coming. Well, for instance, my tax statement to the United States of America, I couldn't send. And they don't understand. So I managed to find a private carrier and pay about 70 American dollars just to send in a report that I don't owe the Americans any money.
Yeah.
Well, anyhow.
If only we had electronic communication that they would accept.
That's when we degenerate into some good
we'll say that for after.
Cursing. What my mother used to call tax language when my father was doing taxes. There is I love here the idea that you draw back, it seems, with Roslyn and Matthew and edit a series that just talks about loss and the literary culture of Shakespeare's time. Because lost play signals loss. And I would like you to maybe, for our viewers, talk about this idea of loss in this period.
So I'm quite fascinated by the idea of loss, and I think I first started getting into lost plays specifically as an undergraduate. I remember seeing the Norton edition, is it? I think no, the Oxford edition, one of those complete works, well, Norton based on Oxford anyway, where they had entries for Cardenio and Love's Labours Won amongst all the full Shakespeare texts that were there. And there was only a page or two where they acknowledged that those plays had once existed, but that was fascinating to have included that allusion to lost plays in a complete works edition. And so I've had a long-standing interest in loss in that sense. But of course, when we work with loss in early modern theatre, especially from the perspective that I adopt, the repertory studies perspective that Roslyn Knutson really pioneered, of focusing on the play as the basic commodity that a company owned, and using that as the basis for commercial competition, rather than fetishizing the author or anything else as an organizing principle. So when we take that repertory studies approach and we think about playing companies and commerce, we have an inbuilt safety net for understanding loss, because we don't necessarily need a play text in order to understand why a company may have acquired a play on a specific topic or in a specific form or genre at the time that they did. It makes sense in relation to other companies' offerings or the successful offerings of that own company in the first place. So you can start doing interesting things because of the logic of how companies acquired plays when they did in response to what others were doing. But of course, not everything has that sort of safety net. And I look at our friends who work in the classics, people who work on Sappho, with just, a couple of words in a line even sometimes. And I have no idea how they work with that level of loss, given that each of these classical writers was writing in very different contexts, and the classical theatre even was nothing like the repertory theatre of London. So they don't have that to fall back on, this logical underpinning of commercial offerings. So they have a very different experience of loss. So after the 2014 book that Matt Steggle and I edited specifically on lost plays in Shakespeare's England, we were thinking more about loss in a broader sense, a more capacious sense, other forms of loss, things beyond play text specifically, thinking about performance of plays, thinking about things beyond London, beyond England, thinking about things that weren't plays, in some cases lost people even, lost concepts altogether. And so we really wanted to broaden that idea of loss and think more broadly about acknowledging very openly just how much of the core information that should be our bread and butter, that we deal with on a daily basis as early modernists, actually suffers from archival loss. So the bigger project here, I think, is to stop dancing around all these gaps in our knowledge and pretending they're not there, and building confident sounding narratives on what's really quite a fragile foundation. And instead, we hope through that book, in the way that it showcased a variety of loss, that we could be a bit more open about how we have to work with these gaps in our knowledge and the limits of what can be said responsibly, and also offer some models for ways to conjecture responsibly, I suppose, so that people get a sense of, well, it's not the end of the world. If we acknowledge the elephant in the room, that we're missing all this data, all this information, that doesn't mean the end of our field. In fact, it's remarkably generative because it allows us to return to what we thought we knew with fresh eyes. It's, you know, when graduate students approach me asking me what they should write their thesis on or asking for suggestions, one of the pieces of advice I usually give them is to start off with something that you have always taken for granted as being self-evidently true, and ask why. And just return to it and think, you know, should I always have accepted this as the truth? You know, why have I always thought this was the truth? And let's just go back to exploring those premises that have led to that conclusion and see whether they actually hold up. And maybe they do, but often they don't, or often there's new ways to approach things and to sort of get to know the period better. And so this broader project on loss was along those lines, really. It was trying to think about new ways to practice scholarship so that we as scholars retain authority, because we do have the expertise, but it doesn't cost us anything to acknowledge when we don't know something, or when something is unknowable, because that data, that documentary evidence simply isn't there. And I think it's ultimately, we do a disservice to future generations of scholars if we elide over those gaps and pretend they're not there and just assert something. And then they have to do all this legwork to undo those assumptions and return to the primary evidence themselves to work out, why did he say that? Why did he write that? He had no reason to say that. That's misleading. Let's just clear all that debris and start again, and be very open about what we do and don't know, and then let people come to it with their own conclusions, their own arguments.
Yeah, that's interesting. That coincides with the review that I just wrote with someone who was pointing out that Frederick Boas, back in the day, Boas, a sort of rescued kid, Thomas Kidd, from obscurity, even though he sort of rode Marlowe's tales through the revival period in the 19th century, that Boas kind of felt Kidd, he just in his edition. And then later on, scholars basically just reamed him for his inaccuracies and so forth. But the proposal was arguing that the basis for Kidd's importance never was challenged. It was just mistakes that Boas made here and there. But anyway, what it comes up to is that after World War II, in my reading, that's not what this writer said, but it looks to me, and I remember these guys, they were very old when I came along, but they were strident. You know, post-World War II America, basically, we're more scientific, we're more empirical, we have better tools. And these guys in the past, you know, look at these mistakes, and they, you know, kind of tore at them and says, not their time, is our time. Well, in my generation, perhaps in yours, I think that we have become maybe a little too obsequious in our view of our forebears, right? You know, the greats ahead of us, and you know, there was too much of that progressivist mentality and post-war criticism, and there may be a little too little now, where we might want to step forward and talk about, listen, this is our time. Let's see what we can do to push this forward, which I think is ancillary, at least, to what you are talking about. And also, I love the idea of looking at what's not there. That's so revealing.
I think we're so fortunate at the moment, and this brings back to the discussion of the digital humanities earlier on, that we are in a position now where we can enable widespread access to the raw documentary evidence that we're using as the basis for our arguments. Part of the problem that people often have, myself included, with some of the 19th century giants of the field, is that they had very privileged positions in terms of being able to access these primary documents in the British Museum and other places that most scholars could never get to see firsthand. And they could compare things that most people couldn't compare because most people didn't get access to these sources. And so the Edmund Malones of the world, for every wonderful thing they said, there were also all the other things that you could never check whether it was accurate or not. It's a bit like during Shakespeare's lifetime, there's that proverb that travelers may lie with authority. And the idea being that no one can travel as far as them to verify the tales they tell of men whose heads do grow beneath the shoulders and so forth, right? That's what the 19th century scholars were like. If Frederick Gard Flier said something about Henslow, you had to accept it, because when were you ever going to go to Dulwich College to see Henslow's papers in person to fact check Flier? You couldn't do it. So we now have a quantitatively different approach in the sense that we are digitizing materials or transcribing materials or making things available so that people can actually see our working as well as our conclusions these days. And I think now that everyone can fact check, that brings about a shift, qualitative shift in the way people then have to write about this period and think about the conclusions they're drawing. Because it's a very different ballgame now compared to 150 years ago, you know?
Well, we're going in a direction, I had to mention this, and it's a little bit controversial now.
Go on, shoot.
the small little program that I have here. It is something I enjoyed greatly when it happened was your article on the Wild Goose Chase. And was it the Madman and the Professor, or the Professor and the Madman? I can't remember the order in that title. That book that I enjoyed so much maybe 20 years ago with the origins of the OED and how kind of eccentric and crazy it was, and it turned into this monument. Anyhow, you pointed out that, you know, of course, Wild Goose Chase, that term was attributed to Shakespeare. You've done some more work in this area of showing how we tend to reify these authors and give them everything, whereas they're basically echoing what they're hearing around them, what they're reading around them, and that's far more interesting in terms of even their creative capability to show how they mix and match all of these things that are echoing around them. But anyway, I think that what happened, now correct me if I'm wrong, you put this out in an academic publication, and somehow it got picked up by local media, and it went sort of viral that the OED had missed this, and then suddenly all of this attention is on you. And I was talking with Pip Wilcox at the National Archives, and I brought this up. I said, you know, and she said, well, she lives in, she knows people who work at the OED now. And she says, I will assure you, that they are, very politely, that they are working on this and they're using EBO and these resources too now. But it is fabulous that you would shine light on it. I want to say that. And I also want to say that I could never anywhere near the altar of the OED.
Let me tell you the story about that, Tom. That was ridiculous. I was having out of body experience at that point, because the local media that you mentioned, ended up becoming the New York Times and the BBC and the Guardian, and people in India and people in China and all sorts of amazing media outlets were covering this story, which was not a story in my mind. But we have a platform, an electronic platform at my university, a bit like The Conversation, if you know that platform, which is a sort of academia meets news hybrid, designed to try and showcase latest academic research or insights, I suppose, expert commentary on topical issues. So we have our own version of that called Pursuit, and some really wonderful editors who work on that platform for us. And one of the things that the senior editor said to me at the time was, well, maybe you don't feel like you've got anything to write for us right now as a public engagement piece, but I guarantee you there are universal truths in your discipline that every Shakespearean knows, but the people outside the academy just haven't got the faintest idea about. So, one of the things that you need to take seriously as a public intellectual, because, university positions are taxpayer funded, you've got to share that knowledge. You've got to think about how you can bring that off campus to a wider audience. And so the first things I thought about was those posters and tea towels and things you see that, did you know Shakespeare invented all these words and these, every Shakespearean will cringe when they see those posters, because we all know he didn't invent those words. If a playgoer went to a Shakespeare play for 2.5 hours, 3 hours, and every word they were hearing was some gibberish that he'd made up, it wouldn't make sense. Clearly these words signified, they had semantic content, they're in circulation. Occasionally there's a nice turn of phrase or a unique image or metaphor that we can trace back to Shakespeare putting these things together for the first time in interesting ways. But by and large, he didn't invent the words. I think when Caliban offers to get fresh scamels from the rocks, scamels is like the one word in the whole Shakespearean canon that we have no idea what the hell it means or where he got that. He really seems to just invented that, unless it was the compositor who typeset it, who mistyped it somehow. So this piece wasn't ever meant to be showcasing new research as such, and it wasn't even having a go at the OED as such. it was about trying to let the public know that, well, you know, here's this thing that's always touted as being why Shakespeare is great, his invention of words. That's not why he's great. Look, when the OED was being assembled back in the centuries ago, one of the things that distinguished that dictionary from others was the fact that it showed examples of the words in use. And to do that, they would turn to widely available examples. And the works of Shakespeare was, you know, on the desk at the time, basically. It's a go-to source to look up, how did Shakespeare use this? And that makes sense. That's part of the historical project of the OED. That's why they did it the way they did. But people have then subsequently misunderstood that process and thought that if the first instance is Shakespeare, then Shakespeare invented it. And now that we have these digital tools like Google Books and early English books online, it takes all of 5 seconds to type a phrase into the search box and disprove that notion and show just how much earlier a word or phrase was in cultural currency. And so that's all I wanted to say, but it's really interesting that then the media all picks this up. Some in particular were cross that an Australian academic had dared to speak truth to power and correct the Brits over it. Like, as if there was anything nationalistic about this. This is just a common sense public engagement piece. But they had a field day with that. It was quite funny.
Well, it's all good. It's all good. Anytime you bring attention to this, and of course, you know, we all get irritated when something's attributed to Shakespeare, even correctly, but actually is attributed to a Shakespearean character. Like, if we were never borrowers or lenders, we would be in pretty bad shape, economically.
That's right.
Globally. There may be too much of it going on, but still, that's what drives economies, is borrowing and lending. Mm-hmm. And Shakespeare never said that, of course. And so or Polonius said it, I should say, so anybody who might fall into this. Well, that all just is extraordinarily delightful for me, that we can bring a little bit more clarity into what were the sources of, let's just say, creative energy, how that works, rather than falling yet for another century under the auspices of post-romantic searches for genius and inventiveness, where you're hit by the muse and you suddenly see things, you see the light on your various road to various, Damascuses, but the real creative process of hearing and listening and being part of the world around you and putting together narratives and from various sources that entertain people and that also endure. So that was a little speech there. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, and I'm just it's just wonderful to have that in every conversation. What I do is ask. We deal with, I'm talking to people who are very bright, who could have gone in many, many directions in their lives. And in all cases, there seems to have been just an early childhood understanding that maybe we are nerds, or there's a point at which you turn. With me, it was a foreign study that I did in undergraduate school, where I'm going, it doesn't look like I'm going to go home and be a successful insurance guy, which would have been just fine. It's a wonderful life. I've been infected now. This is, probably the wrong word to use right now, but I have seen something that I don't think I can ever return to, that I've loved so much. And so is there any kind of point where, let's say, young David is wandering around? Did you grow up in Melbourne? Is that where you?
I did, that's right.
Yeah. And so young David is in Melbourne in school and being whatever, and suddenly you go, well, I think that I'm going to go and study literature. And have like in my case, I always mention it's not mythological, real uncle who just could not understand what in the world I was going to do with a major in English. What are you going to do with that? So we all kind of face this. When were the turning points, and at what point did you realize that you were going to head in this direction?
I think I had a number of those turning points, to be fair. I think when I was 13, I first read Shakespeare. I'm sure I'd seen Shakespeare earlier, but I was meant to be reading a play called Away by the Australian playwright Michael Gow. And it begins with an epigraph that quotes The Tempest. And so before I even got to the first page of that play, I went, well, I better find out what this epigraph's about. Went off and read The Tempest. And then I was hooked on Shakespeare. I love The Tempest. It's still my favorite play. It's a play that a 13-year-old boy could read and enjoy in a very simple way. It makes sense. but every time you come back to it and revisit it, it becomes more complex, and you see things and subtleties in it, nuances in it that you missed earlier, and you can appreciate anew. So that play in particular is one of my favorite Shakespearean plays. And I was about 13 at that point. In high school, literature was one of my worst subjects, got my worst marks. But I think when I was in literature classes, my brain was being very scientific. And when I was in science classes, chemistry classes, I was more of a humanities brain, and never quite worked. And then when I get to university, there's different ways of studying both those disciplines, and you can be more scientific and rigorous in the approach to literature in a quantitative way, or a theatre history, factual study kind of way, rather than necessarily doing the close reading or doing theoretical insights and things like that. So I found more ways that my interest in literature could actually flourish. I think the importance of good teachers, of course, can never be underestimated. And I just for fun more than anything else, I indulged and did one of those Cambridge summer schools when I was an undergraduate. And Dympna Callaghan was my teacher there. It was the time that she was editing Romeo and Juliet for the Bedford St. Martin series. And Dympna, if you've ever met her or had the good fortune to be taught by her, is an amazing educator, just so inspiring. And I very clearly remember after 3 weeks of that summer school in Dympna's class, her asking, "So have you decided to be an academic yet?" and what could I say? But of course, yes, you've done it, you've converted me. So I think that was probably a really important moment too.
I met Dympna, and she probably doesn't remember me. I remember her. She gave a paper at a Marlowe conference, and I might get this wrong. It was the year 1993.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it was, kind of plenary speaker was Patrick Collinson at Cambridge, but we were at Corpus Christi. It was held at Corpus Christi, a Marlowe conference. And is it Charles Nicole, the writer who did he was there, and he had just published that book, and he was waiting for all of this, just to be, I don't know, kind of cast out of the inner circle because he's a popular writer. And instead he was completely embraced. And I remember Dympna, I remember several other names, I won't go into it, but it was one of those transformative conferences where you just knew that there were people like you out there. And even though there may be few, there were people like you. And it was just delightful. I'm just so happy. This shows sort of the difference in our ages, because we were much younger then, all right? Or maybe, as Dylan said, we were much older then and we're younger now. But anyhow, it was a different time. And so she has had this marvelous career and has influenced you and other people. And I think that would be something it's best for all of us to remember, that when we're teaching, we really do hone in. We home in on the students who aren't getting it, who are falling asleep in the back. And sometimes it's very discouraging. And we think, well, we get angry with the student or angry with the whole thing and start we don't see the people that we actually influence. And there are those people out there, and I meet them occasionally, and I'll go, "Oh, I did do something. I did help to change a life." It happens too rarely because, my students go out into the big world in this huge city, and sometimes I don't see them ever again. Yeah. But I think probably for the teachers who may watch, to keep an eye on that kid, up front, the quiet kid who's kind of, they're taking it in. Also, if I could, I wish I could just broadcast to all my kids, listen, 15 years from now, when you remember something that I said that may have helped change your life for the better, why don't you send me an email?
Yeah.
It helps get me through the day after teaching, hundreds and hundreds of students sometimes in these big lecture halls and so forth. Well, that's just wonderful. And so you went in, you were at Melbourne, and you did a master's at Toronto. And
I went on exchange to the University of Oslo when I was an undergraduate. So I've lived in Norway for a little while, and then I did my master's in Toronto. So I had another cold climate experience for tertiary study.
Yeah, well, a Commonwealth experience for sure. In Australia and Canada. My son graduated from Queen's a couple of years back in Ontario, and almost went to U of T, but I've gone to Toronto 1, 2, 3 times in the past 5 years. I feel part Canadian now. And I'll tell you what, if you get there when it's not winter, what a wonderful town. And but it is.
Well, we don't get any snow in
cold.
Melbourne, so it was pretty amazing when there was snow in
It's cold.
Toronto. It
Yeah.
was very, very cold. I've never been so cold in my life.
It is the dictionary. It is the OED definition of cold.
Nicely done.
But a fabulous university, as is Melbourne, of course, and some fabulous people there who have helped sustain our field, and also in medieval studies too, very famous that way. But what a great experience. Well, I would like to get just kind of open things up here. I think we've sort of covered it. But I may have missed something that you want to get out there. And what we do, I should tell people, is that I go back through and I make little segments that are under topic headings, anything that we covered, so that you don't, if you don't have time to listen to an hour's worth or an hour and 90 minutes worth of podcasting, that people can see that. Is there anything else you'd like to put out there that could be a bullet point or a segment that I've failed to ask you about?
I think you've been very thorough, actually, Tom. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Well, what I'm hoping, David, is that somewhere in the future, 5 years from now, 8 years from now, you don't know what, that this will still be out there, and that people will see what is a younger version of you, and they'll say, well, and you would see it, and that there's this chronicle. I had an uncle, and I mentioned him in another podcast, who wrote 5 books, and there's only one video of him being interviewed on national television in 1958, I believe. And that's all I have of him. That's all I have of this guy who wrote all of these things. And that's part of our theme here, that this will not be lost. And this is something that is found. And I hope that it survives, and that YouTube doesn't go under and everything. Well, we have backup copies and so forth. We'll find the next YouTube. But in any case, there is nothing. This gives me nothing but absolute joy to be able to talk to you and all the others on this program. And if you could stay for a moment right afterwards and debrief, but I wanted to thank you very much, and thank the University of Melbourne for allowing, getting you off the treadmill there for a little while to come talk to me. And I also wanted to point out that, Japan is between where you are and sometimes where you go, like if you're going to the UK, there could be a stopover, and we could maybe have you talk to the Shakespeare Society of Japan, or some of my students and so forth. And so just let me know. If you come in and out and don't let me know, then I'm going to hold it against you. And
I've never been to Japan. I would love to go one day. That sounds wonderful.
You would love it here. You would love it there. People are so gracious and welcoming. When you've been here for 20 or more years like me, I'm old hat, but when you're new and fresh and come in, nothing better. Great food, great people. And we hope to see you in person very soon. But thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Tom. Thank you for having me.